War. War means new military technology is bound to be invented and tested. The Germans refined submarine technology, or the U-boat, which is short for Unterseebooten in German, as well as poison gas. The British introduced the tank to smash through barbed wire, and the Americans and French led in airplane technology.
Between 1914 and 1918, a revolutionary new theatre of war was created, the air. It brought sights never seen or imagined before. There were massive dogfights.
I can see the scene now. It was just like a cloud of flies in the sky. All moving quickly, of course, very quickly, and diving.
There were terrible crashes, and a casualty rate which at times meant pilots were almost certain to be killed.
I kissed my mother. I cleared everything right up, and I said, "Goodbye, Mum. I don't think I shall ever see you again." And that is the attitude you had to take. You were going to die.
This air war saw aeroplanes which somehow took off from a platform on a ship's guns. And the invention of a radical new concept, the aircraft carrier. It fueled a technological arms race as designers on both sides sought to outwit each other. A race which ushered in the modern age of fighters and bombers. And a new breed of hero, the ace.
Now, with all of these new technologies, the reality was a hole in the ground became a horrible symbol for the war. These holes, primarily located in France, were called trenches. In trench warfare, armies dug these trenches to remain out of sight. Soldiers lived, fought, and died in these trenches. Most fighting in the trenches was done at night. Sometimes trenches were so close that the enemy could hear the other side. The area between the trenches was referred to as no man's land, and trench warfare was the defining battle strategy for World War I.
Training grounds of England in 1915, apple-cheeked recruits and old soldiers are learning how to dig. This army that just a few years before had thrown its spades away, saying that entrenched warfare was a thing of the past. Now they are learning the anatomy of a trench, the novelty of warfare without movement. The model trench works. 40 yards ahead of the main trench, the listening posts for advance warning. Behind the main trench, a maze of support trenches and redoubts called strong points, intersected by traverses or zigzags, reserve trenches and communication centers. In theory, on the drill field, a neat and orderly design. In practice, in France, a disorder of slime, rubble, and mud. The Germans have purposely entrenched in the higher ground. In some sectors, the drainage from their trenches is pumped downhill into the Allied lines. Never before has France seen so much rain. Troops and country folk blame it on the artillery. They say the cannonading has loosened the skies. There is water everywhere, but little to use. Water is weight, and most of what is brought up to the main line, heavily chlorinated, is for drinking and cooking only. It is almost impossible to get rid of what a correspondent calls the great unmentioned fact of war, the smell of unwashed humanity.
So that's just a little glimpse into trench warfare. I'm going to see if these audio clips will play a little bit more as to life in the trenches.
Nothing to see but bare mud walls, nowhere to sit but on a wet, muddy ledge, no shelter of any kind against the weather except the clothes you are wearing, no exercise you can take in order to warm yourself. World War I soldier.
More about the trenches. The Germans were the first to get their hands dirty. Under the command of General Erich von Falkenhayn, they built the first trenches in September 1914. The Germans believed that building trenches would provide protection from the advancing French and British troops. Also, the Germans had a tactical advantage because they were on higher ground. The trenches of their opponents were just above sea level, so they always filled with water, creating many problems for the soldiers. In this next excerpt from a British soldier's diary, we can learn about some of the examples of how the water-filled trenches affected British soldiers.
These are ankle-deep mud. In some places, trenches are waist-deep in water. Time is spent digging, filling sandbags, building up parapets, fetching saws, etc. One does not have time to be wary. Private Livesay.
As the war dragged on, trenches were dug deep enough so that a man could walk through them without showing his head above ground. Obviously, fighting from the water-filled trenches must have been even more traumatic for soldiers than earlier forms of ground warfare. Listen to this excerpt.
The trench, when we reached it, was half full of mud and water. We set to work to try to drain it. Our efforts were hampered by the fact that the French, who had first occupied it, had buried their dead in the bottom in dyes. Every stroke of the pick encountered a body. The smell was awful. Private Pollard.
The trenches were often connected to the supply lines, a system of tunnels. Defenses for the trenches became stronger as time went on. As you can see in this British soldier's diary excerpt, sometimes enemies held an unspoken truce. Perhaps their horrific experiences in the trenches created a temporary bond between them. Imagine how Private Terry must have felt while listening to this excerpt.
We have just come out of the trenches after being in for 6 days, and up to our waist in water. While we were in the trenches, one of the Germans came over to our trench for a cigarette, and then back again, and he was not fired at. We and the Germans started walking about in the open, between the two trenches, repairing them, and there was no firing at all. I think they're all getting fed up with it. Private Stanley Terry.
Defenses made a successful attack or charge from the trenches virtually impossible. Still, commanders on both sides ordered their troops to go over the top. An order to attack the other side, which meant leaving the relative safety of the trenches, was a virtual death sentence. Machine gun fire killed the soldiers as they crawled on elbows and knees, bellies dragging towards the enemy soldiers. Soldiers from both sides shot at each other as they slowly advanced towards each other. Dead and dying men littered the ground between the trenches. Bodies also fell on barbed wire, and although soldiers from both sides tried to pull wounded men back into the trenches for basic first aid, some could not be disentangled from the wire and were left hanging to die. Now, the most dreaded weapon of the war was the submarine, because it could attack without warning. In addition, submarines were easily capable of violating international law without detection. The 1900 First London Naval Treaty stated that a merchant vessel couldn't be attacked until its crew and papers were in a safe place. The British Navy blockaded Germany during the war. Germany used U-boats to break the blockade. German subs destroyed a significant percentage of the British Navy. Do you think international laws, like this one, should be followed in times of war? Interesting to think about. Because of the sinking of a ship, Americans were on the verge of war. On May 7, 1915, the Lusitania, a British passenger liner, sailing from New York bound for England, was sunk by a German sub. The Germans had warned the liner not to sail because their leaders, the German leaders, believed contraband, weapons, were on board. The sinking of the British ship was a major reason for the United States to enter World War I, even though the United States did not officially declare war until 2 years later. 128 Americans were killed, mostly women and children, when the German U-boat blew up the Lusitania in the North Sea. From Germany, Wilson demanded an apology, money, and a promise not to let it happen again. Germany did not agree to all demands. The German government took out numerous ads in the New York newspapers warning the passengers and crew of the Lusitania about serious repercussions if sailed. You can see that right there. It has never been proven if American contraband was aboard, but it has been speculated.
On May the 7th, 1915, the Cunard liner, the Lusitania, set sail for Britain from the United States. Alice Drury, nanny for an American family, was looking after the baby when the first German torpedo struck.
I just picked up the shawl and the baby with it. Stuart was also in the cabin, and he was crying, "I don't want to be drowned. I don't want to be drowned." And I crossed over to him and said, "Hang on to me whatever happens." And he did. The other nurse called down to me, "What shall I do?" I said, "You look after the baby." I never saw her or Bunny ever again.
Over 1,200 people drowned in the Lusitania.
It gives the British a real advantage, which they exploit very effectively. British propaganda in this war is going to be one of the major weapons, and the principal target is the opinion of the United States. The Lusitania is a godsend to the British. It's quite the most stupid thing the Germans could have done.
The torpedoing and sinking of the Lusitania evinces a disregard of opinions of the world in general and of this country in particular, only compatible with the assumption that bloodlust has toppled reason from its throne.
Much of the outrage fell on the Kaiser himself.
That was wicked. Oh, it should never have happened because if he'd have been a good man, he'd have said, well, it's full of all civilians. What do I want with sinking that? Let the thing go where it wants to go. That would have been my sentiment, but it wasn't his. It was just to form something which would shock the English people, you know. We're not playing at games, this is real now.